My son locked me in the basement and shouted, "You'll only get out of there when you transfer your pension to me every month." What he didn't know was that I had already planned for this and hidden something in the basement. When he went to check it the next day, 17 cops arrived. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The metal door slammed shut above me with a finality that made my chest tighten. The sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot, followed by the scraping of something heavy being dragged across the floor overhead. My own son had just locked me in my own basement. "Dad, you're going to stay down there until you transfer your entire pension to my account every month." Paul's voice filtered through the wooden ceiling, muffled but clear enough to make my blood run cold. I'm not kidding around anymore. I stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, my 60-year-old knees still aching from the rough shove that had sent me tumbling down here 20 minutes ago. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls, making the familiar space feel like a prison cell. This was my basement, in the house where I'd raised Paul after his mother died, and now it had become my cage. "Paul, son, please," I called up, my voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. "Let's talk about this upstairs. Like adults." His laugh was bitter, empty of any warmth I remembered from his childhood. "We're way past talking, old man. You had your chance to do this the easy way." The easy way. I pressed my palm against the cool concrete wall, trying to steady myself as the full weight of what was happening settled over me. For months, Paul had been asking for money. First, it was just a few $100s here and there, car repairs, overdue bills, groceries. Then it escalated to thousands. When I started asking questions about where the money was going, he became defensive, angry. When I finally said no to his request for $5,000 last week, he'd exploded. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. My own flesh and blood had just physically trapped me in my own home, demanding control of the pension I'd worked 37 years to earn. I heard his footsteps moving around upstairs, the familiar creak of the floorboards above the kitchen. He was pacing, probably planning his next move. The thought made my stomach churn. How long had he been planning this? The whole thing felt too organized, too deliberate to be a spur-of-the-moment decision. "You know, Dad," his voice drifted down again, closer to the basement door now. "I've been thinking about this for a while. Mom always said you were too stubborn for your own good." Guess she was right. The mention of Margaret hit me like a physical blow. My wife had been gone for 3 years now, and Paul knew exactly how much her loss still hurt. To use her memory as a weapon in this twisted game made something inside me harden with resolve I hadn't felt in years. I moved away from the stairs, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer corners of the basement. This space held 30 years of memories. Holiday decorations in dusty boxes, Paul's old baseball equipment, Margaret's sewing machine covered with a sheet. But as I looked around now, something else caught my attention. In the far corner behind a stack of paint cans, I could see the edge of something that most people would overlook entirely. A small metal box, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. My heart began to beat faster, but not from fear this time. 6 months ago, when Paul's behavior had started becoming more erratic and his demands for money more frequent, I'd made a decision that I'd hoped I'd never need to act on. Call it intuition, call it a father's worst nightmare coming true, but I'd sensed that this day might come. "Paul," I called up again, keeping my voice steady. "What exactly do you think this is going to accomplish? You can't keep me down here forever. Watch me," came his reply, followed by the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor. He was barricading the door. "I've got all the time in the world, Dad, and you've got a nice fat pension check coming in 2 weeks. One way or another, that money's going to start coming to me." I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of heartbreak and something else, something I hadn't expected to feel: relief. Because despite the horror of this situation, despite the devastating realization that my son had become someone I no longer recognized, I wasn't helpless, not entirely. Moving carefully in the dim light, I made my way to the far corner of the basement. The concrete floor was cold under my feet, and I could smell the musty scent of old cardboard and mothballs. Behind the paint cans, exactly where I'd left it, was the small fireproof box I'd hidden 6 months ago. Inside were things Paul didn't know about, things I'd hoped never to use. But as I heard him moving furniture around upstairs, as the reality of my imprisonment sank in fully, I realized that all my careful preparation was about to be put to the test. "You know what, Paul? I said, loud enough for him to hear, as I carefully lifted the box from its hiding place. You're absolutely right about one thing. You don't know your father as well as you think you do. The silence from upstairs stretched for several long moments. Then I heard his footsteps again, faster this time, moving toward the basement door. What's that supposed to mean? His voice had lost some of its cocky confidence. I smiled in the darkness, my fingers tracing the edges of the metal box. It means you should have thought this through a little better, son. You should have asked yourself why an old man like me wasn't more surprised by what you just did. Why I'm not begging or panicking down here. Shut up, Dad. You're just trying to mess with my head. But I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Good. Let him wonder. Let him start to realize that maybe, just maybe, he'd underestimated his old man. Because while Paul had been planning his little extortion scheme, I'd been planning something too. Something that would teach him a lesson he'd never forget and protect other families from the monster my son had apparently become. The box felt heavier than I remembered as I held it in my hands, but then again, the weight of what was inside had always been more than just physical. The basement had grown colder as the hours passed, or maybe it was just the chill that had settled into my bones as I sat on an old wooden crate, the metal box balanced on my knees. From upstairs I could hear Paul moving around, occasionally talking on his phone in hushed tones. Whatever he was planning, he wasn't working alone. I opened the box carefully, the hinges creaking in the silence. Inside, nestled between layers of protective foam, were items that told a story Paul didn't know I was writing. A small digital recorder, no bigger than a matchbox, a USB drive, several manila folders filled with photographs and printed documents, and at the bottom, a smartphone that Paul had never seen before. As I held these items, my mind drifted back to when this all started. It wasn't 6 months ago when I'd hidden this box. It was 3 years ago, at Margaret's funeral, when I first noticed something was wrong with our son. Margaret had been sick for 8 months before she passed. During that time, Paul visited maybe 6 times. 6 times in 8 months while his mother was dying. Each time he came, he seemed more interested in asking about her life insurance policy than in spending time with her. I'd brushed it off then, telling myself he was just dealing with grief in his own way. But at the funeral, while I was shaking hands with neighbors and old friends who'd come to pay their respects, I overheard Paul on his phone in the church parking lot. He was talking to someone about money, about finally getting what was coming to him. When he saw me approaching, he hung up quickly and put on that fake smile I was beginning to recognize. That's when the real Paul started to emerge. In the months after Margaret's death, the requests for money became constant. First, he needed $2,000 for car repairs, then $1,500 for rent. Then $3,000 for some business opportunity that never seemed to materialize. Each time he had a story, an excuse, a reason why his old dad should open his wallet. And like a fool, I kept giving. I'd told myself I was helping him through a rough patch, that grief affects people differently, that he'd find his way eventually. But deep down, I think I knew the truth long before I was ready to admit it. Paul wasn't grieving, he was calculating. The breaking point came 4 months ago on what would have been Margaret's birthday. I'd gone to visit her grave alone, needing some quiet time to remember my wife. When I got home, I found Paul in my study, going through my financial papers. He'd used his key to let himself in, thinking I'd be gone longer. "Just wanted to see how you were managing, Dad," he'd said when I caught him red-handed with my bank statements spread across the desk. "You know, making sure you're not being taken advantage of by anyone." The irony wasn't lost on me. That night, after Paul left with another $1,000 he'd guilted me into giving him, I sat in that same chair and made a decision. I started paying attention, really paying attention. I began noticing things I'd been too trusting, too hopeful to see before. Like how Paul never visited anymore unless he needed money. How he always had some emergency that required immediate cash. How he'd started bringing up my pension, asking casual questions about when I'd planned to retire, how much I'd be getting each month. But most disturbing of all, I started noticing how he talked about other people. Other elderly people, specifically. He'd make comments about neighbors, about how these old folks don't even know what they have, or how someone should be helping them manage their money. Comments that made my skin crawl when I really listened to them. So I started documenting everything. Every visit, every request for money, every conversation. The small recorder had captured dozens of hours of Paul's manipulative tactics. The photographs showed him going through my personal belongings when he thought I wasn't looking. The bank statements tracked every dollar I'd given him over the past 2 years, totaling more than $37,000. But what really made my blood run cold was what I'd discovered about how he was spending that money. Through some careful investigation and a few conversations with people who knew people, I'd learned that Paul wasn't just taking advantage of his grieving father. He was part of something bigger, something that targeted elderly people across the county. The USB drive contained evidence of financial records I'd obtained, showing a pattern of elderly victims who'd been systematically drained of their savings. The smartphone had recordings of conversations I'd never thought I'd need to make. And the manila folders contained photographs and documents that painted a picture of a man I no longer recognized as my son. Paul had gotten greedy, sloppy. He'd started talking too freely around people who knew me, people who cared enough to mention things that didn't seem right. Like how he'd been seen at the homes of other elderly residents in town, always leaving with envelopes or small bags. How he'd been asking questions about people's medications, their family situations, their financial circumstances. My son hadn't just become a thief. He'd become a predator. The sound of Paul's voice on the phone upstairs broke through my memories. He was getting agitated about something, his voice rising even though I couldn't make out the words. Whatever timeline he was working on, something wasn't going according to plan. I carefully placed everything back in the box except for the smartphone. This particular device was connected to a system that Paul couldn't possibly know about, because I'd set it up during one of his many absences. It had taken me weeks to figure out how to use all the technology, but Margaret had always said I was more capable than I gave myself credit for. The phone showed that my earlier suspicions were correct. The system had been recording everything that happened in the house since Paul had locked me down here. Every threat, every admission, every phone conversation he'd made while believing he was safe to speak freely. More importantly, it was connected to a timer system that I'd hoped never to use. In 18 hours, if I didn't reset the timer, certain people would receive very interesting packages, people who had the authority to act on the information I'd been gathering for months. Paul thought he was so clever, so in control. He thought he'd finally cornered his weak old father into submission. But what he didn't understand was that while he'd been planning his little extortion scheme, I'd been preparing for war. A war to protect, not just myself, but every other elderly person in this county who might fall victim to whatever operation my son was running. I heard his footsteps on the stairs coming down to check on his prisoner. Good. It was time for the next phase of his education to begin. As the basement door opened and light spilled down the stairway, I slipped the phone back into the box and closed the lid. When Paul appeared at the bottom of the stairs, I was sitting quietly on my crate, hands folded, looking for all the world like a defeated old man. But inside, the timer was already counting down. Paul descended the stairs with the swagger of someone who believed he held all the cards. In his hands were a manila folder and what looked like official documents. Behind that cocky expression, though, I could see something else. Impatience. Whatever timeline he was working with, he was feeling pressure. "Hope you've had time to think things through, Dad," he said, settling onto an overturned bucket about 6 feet away from me. Close enough to intimidate, far enough to feel safe. "Because I've got some paperwork here that's going to make this whole process a lot easier." I looked up at him with what I hoped appeared to be resigned defeat. "What kind of paperwork?" He opened the folder with theatrical flair, pulling out several official-looking documents. "Power of attorney forms, already filled out, just need your signature. This way, I can handle all your financial affairs without having to keep you locked up down here." The audacity of it took my breath away. He'd come prepared with legal documents to steal my life savings, probably forged or obtained through whatever network he was working with. This wasn't a desperate son asking for help. This was a calculated criminal operation. "And if I refused to sign?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Paul's smile turned cold. "Then you stay down here until you change your mind. I've got friends who can bring me food and nobody's going to come looking for you for a while. Face it, Dad, since Mom died, who actually checks on you regularly? Mrs. Henderson next door? She's half deaf and minds her own business. Your brother Mike? He lives 3 states away and calls maybe twice a year." Each word was chosen to hurt, to make me feel isolated and helpless. And if I really were just a lonely old man with no resources, his strategy might have worked. But Paul had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed I'd been sitting passively in my grief for the past 3 years instead of learning, preparing, and documenting. I reached for the documents with trembling hands, playing my part. "Let me see what you want me to sign." As I pretended to read through the papers, I was actually activating the small device hidden in my shirt pocket. It was no bigger than a button, but it would send a signal to the smartphone in my hidden box. Phase 1 of my contingency plan was now in motion. The power of attorney documents were even worse than I'd expected. They weren't just giving Paul access to my pension, they were granting him complete control over all my assets, my home, even my medical decisions. If I signed these papers, I'd be legally helpless, entirely at his mercy. "This gives you everything," I said, looking up at him. "The house, my savings, my pension, everything." "That's right." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "But don't worry, Dad. I'll take good care of you. You'll have everything you need." The lie rolled off his tongue so easily that I wondered how long he'd been practicing it. I could see it now. Once he had legal control, I'd probably have some kind of accident or medical emergency that would leave him free to do whatever he wanted with my assets. "And what about your business partners?" I asked carefully. "The people you've been talking to on the phone upstairs?" Paul's confident expression faltered for just a moment. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Come on, son. I may be old, but I'm not deaf. You've been making calls, discussing timelines, talking about other people. This isn't just about you needing money, is it?" The mask slipped completely then, and for a moment I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Paul wasn't just greedy or desperate. He was enjoying this. The power, the control, the ability to manipulate and intimidate. This was who he'd become, and maybe who he'd always been beneath the surface. "You know what, Dad? You're right. This isn't just about me." He stood up, pacing in the small space like a predator circling prey. "There are a lot of elderly people in this county who have more money than they know what to do with. People who live alone, who don't have anyone looking out for them. People who might benefit from some guidance in managing their affairs. People like Mrs. Chen down the street, like old Mr. Rodriguez who lost his wife last year." Paul's smile was answer enough. "You always were too smart for your own good. Yeah, people like them. People like you, actually, except they don't have difficult sons who ask too many questions." My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from rage. My son wasn't just stealing from me. He was part of a network that was systematically targeting and robbing elderly people throughout our community. People I'd known for decades, people who'd attended Margaret's funeral, people who trusted their neighbors and lived quiet, vulnerable lives. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How many what?" "How many people have you stolen from?" Paul laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth or humanity. "Stolen is such an ugly word, Dad. We prefer to think of it as helping people manage their resources more efficiently. And to answer your question, enough to make this whole operation very profitable." He pulled out his phone and showed me something that made my blood freeze. It was a list of names, addresses, and financial information. I recognized at least a dozen of them. Neighbors, people from church, elderly residents I'd known for years. Next to each name was a dollar amount and what looked like a status update. "Mrs. Patterson was particularly generous," Paul continued, scrolling through the list like he was reviewing a grocery order. $43,000 in savings, plus a nice little pension. She was so grateful for our help with her medications and bill paying, right up until her unfortunate fall down the stairs. The casual way he mentioned Mrs. Patterson's death, the sweet old lady who'd made cookies for the neighborhood every Christmas, made something snap inside me, but I forced myself to remain calm, to keep playing the role of the defeated father. "I understand," I said quietly, holding out my hand for the pen he'd brought. "I'll sign the papers." Paul's eyes lit up with triumph. "Now you're being sensible." But as I took the pen, I was thinking about the signal I'd activated, about the timer that was counting down, about all the evidence I'd been gathering for months. Paul thought he was winning, but he had no idea that every word he'd just spoken was being recorded, every admission documented. Most importantly, he had no idea that in 14 hours and 37 minutes, if I didn't reset the timer, copies of everything I'd collected would be automatically delivered to very specific people, people who had the authority and the resources to shut down his operation permanently. I signed the first document with a shaking hand, playing my part perfectly. But inside I was smiling, because while Paul was focused on his immediate victory, I was thinking several moves ahead. And tomorrow, when he came down to check on his captive father, he was going to discover that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. I woke up to the sound of Paul's footsteps overhead, heavier and more erratic than they'd been the night before. Something was wrong. Through the small basement window, I could see dawn breaking, which meant I'd been down here for almost 18 hours. More importantly, it meant my timer was getting close to its target. The documents I'd signed lay on the floor where Paul had left them, but I could hear him on the phone again, his voice strained and urgent. Whatever network he was part of, something had gone sideways overnight. "No, I don't know why Patterson's account got flagged," he was saying, pacing back and forth above me. "The transfer was supposed to be clean." "What do you mean they're asking questions?" Mrs. Patterson again, the woman whose unfortunate fall Paul had mentioned so casually yesterday. I closed my eyes and felt a wave of grief for all the people my son had hurt, all the families he'd destroyed. But that grief was quickly replaced by something else, cold, calculated determination. The basement door opened with a bang, and Paul practically thundered down the stairs. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, and there was a wild look in his eyes that I didn't like. "We need to move faster," he said without preamble. "I need you to call your bank this morning and authorize the pension transfer. Today." "It's Sunday," I pointed out calmly. "Banks are closed. Then we'll use their phone system. You can authorize transfers 24 hours a day." He pulled out his phone and started dialing. "I've got the number right here," but as he held the phone to his ear, something caught his attention. He'd noticed what I'd been hoping he wouldn't see until it was too late, a small red light blinking in the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind an old Christmas tree box. "What is that?" He ended his call and moved toward the corner, squinting in the dim light. I felt my pulse quicken, but kept my expression neutral. "What's what?" "That light. There's something over there." He pushed the Christmas box aside and froze. Behind it was a small black device about the size of a deck of cards, with several lights blinking in sequence. Connected to it were thin wires that disappeared up into the ceiling joists. "What the hell is this, Dad?" I said nothing, just watched as he traced the wires with his eyes, following them across the ceiling to where they disappeared into the wall that separated the basement from my study upstairs. His face went pale as he started to understand. "How long has this been here?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Long enough," I said simply. Paul spun around to face me, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear. "Long enough for what?" Instead of answering, I gestured toward the corner where I'd hidden my box. "Why don't you look around a little more, son? You might find it educational." He stared at me for a long moment, then began searching the basement with frantic energy. It didn't take long for him to find the box behind the paint cans. When he opened it and saw the contents, I watched all the color drain from his face. "You've been recording me," he said, holding up the small digital recorder. "All this time, you've been recording everything. Not just recording, documenting, investigating, planning." I stood up slowly, my old joints protesting, but feeling stronger than I had in years. "You see, Paul, while you were so busy thinking of me as a helpless old man, you forgot something important. I wasn't always retired." He rifled through the manila folders, his hands shaking as he looked at photographs of himself entering other people's homes, copies of financial records, documented timelines of his activities. But it was the smartphone that really made him panic. "What is this?" He held up the device like it might bite him. "That's connected to a system you can't possibly understand. Every conversation we've had, every threat you've made, every admission about Mrs. Patterson and your other victims, it's all been uploaded to a secure server." Paul dropped the phone and grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging in painfully. "What server? What are you talking about?" I smiled, feeling calmer than I had since this whole nightmare began. "Remember when I told you that you should have asked yourself why I wasn't more surprised by what you did? Why an old man like me wasn't begging or panicking? You're bluffing. You don't know anything about servers or recording systems. You can barely use your television remote." That's what you wanted to believe. It made you feel superior, didn't it? Thinking your old dad was just a bumbling retiree who didn't understand the modern world. I pulled free from his grip and brushed off my shirt. "But you never bothered to ask what I did for those 37 years before I retired, did you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Paul had never shown any interest in my work life, never asked about my career or what I'd done to support our family. To him, I'd just been a source of money and an obstacle to his plans. "You worked for the county," he said uncertainly. "Some boring office job." "I worked for the county prosecutor's office, Paul, for 37 years. I was a criminal investigator specializing in financial crimes against the elderly." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, and in a way he was. All those years of dismissing me as a weak old man, all that confidence in his ability to manipulate and control me, crumbled in an instant. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Is it? Did you never wonder how I always seemed to know when you were lying about where the money was going? Did you never question why I never called you out directly, never confronted you about the inconsistencies in your stories?" I moved closer to him, and for the first time since this began, he stepped back. "I was building a case, son, just like I'd done hundreds of times before." Paul looked around the basement with new eyes, seeing it not as a storage space but as what it really was, a crime scene that had been meticulously prepared and documented. Every conversation, every threat, every piece of evidence needed to destroy him and his network. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I can prove everything. Bank transfers, phone records, witness statements, surveillance footage. I've been investigating you and your associates for 6 months, and yesterday, you gave me the final pieces I needed. Your confession about Mrs. Patterson, your admission about the network, your detailed description of how you target elderly victims." I picked up the smartphone and showed him the screen. "This device has been streaming everything to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, not just here in this basement, but everywhere you've been while carrying your phone. Every meeting, every conversation, every transaction." Paul's legs seemed to give out, and he slumped against the wall. "The FBI? Did you really think an operation like yours could target this many elderly victims without eventually attracting federal attention? The only question was whether they'd gather enough evidence to prosecute. Thanks to your detailed confession yesterday, that's no longer a concern." I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if there was still a way out, but there wasn't, and part of him was beginning to understand that. "How long?" he asked finally. I glanced at my watch. "The automated system sent the complete case file to federal agents about 3 hours ago. I'd estimate they're probably reviewing the evidence right now, preparing warrants." Paul's phone rang suddenly, making both of us jump. He looked at the caller ID and his face went even paler. "It's Marcus," he said, referring to someone I assumed was part of his network. "Answer it," I suggested. "But remember, everything's still being recorded." With shaking hands, Paul answered the phone. "Yeah." Even from across the basement, I could hear shouting on the other end. Paul listened for a moment, then hung up without saying a word. "Let me guess," I said. "The FBI just raided one of your associates." He nodded numbly. "Well then," I continued, settling back onto my crate with the satisfaction of a job well done. "I suppose the only question now is whether you're going to wait here for them to come for you, or if you're going to make this even worse by trying to run." Above us, I could hear cars pulling into my driveway. Multiple cars, with engines that sounded official and purposeful. Paul heard them too. The sound of car doors slamming outside made Paul's eyes dart toward the small basement window like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run, and we both knew it. The footsteps on my front porch were heavy, purposeful, and multiple. This wasn't a social call. "Dad, listen to me," Paul said, his voice taking on that pleading tone I remembered from his childhood when he'd been caught doing something wrong. "We can work this out. I'll give back the money. I'll make things right. Just tell them it was all a misunderstanding." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 60 years, but also feeling more alive than I had since Margaret died. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you call Mrs. Patterson's death? What about the Hendersons, who lost their life savings? What about old Mr. Rodriguez, who can't afford his heart medication anymore because you cleaned out his account?" The doorbell rang upstairs, followed immediately by loud, authoritative knocking. Paul flinched at each sound, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool basement air. "You don't understand," he said frantically. "These people I'm working with, they're not going to just let me walk away. If I go to prison, if I cooperate with the FBI, they'll kill me." For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old paternal instinct to protect my son. But then I thought about Mrs. Patterson's funeral, which Paul hadn't bothered to attend. I thought about the families he'd destroyed, the trust he'd shattered, the elderly people who would spend their final years in poverty because of his greed. You should have thought of that before you decided to prey on helpless old people, I said coldly. The knocking upstairs became more insistent, and I could hear voices calling out, "FBI, open the door." The authority in those voices sent a thrill through me that I hadn't expected. After months of careful planning and preparation, justice was finally arriving. Paul's phone buzzed with a text message. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely read it. But when he did, his face went completely white. "They got everyone," he whispered. "Marcus, Tony, even the woman who handles the legal documents. They raided the whole operation." I wasn't surprised. The case file I'd compiled over the past 6 months hadn't just documented Paul's crimes, it had mapped out the entire network. Names, addresses, phone records, financial transactions, meeting locations. Everything the FBI needed to dismantle the organization in one coordinated sweep. "How?" Paul asked, looking at me with something approaching awe. "How did you know about all of them?" I walked over to where he'd found my hidden box and pulled out one of the manila folders he hadn't examined closely. Inside were photographs of Paul meeting with various people over the past several months, along with detailed notes about each interaction. "You became predictable, son. Every Tuesday at the diner on Elm Street with Marcus. Every Friday evening at that bar downtown with Tony. You thought you were being careful, but you forgot that I know this county like the back of my hand. I know every restaurant, every bar, every coffee shop where people conduct business." I showed him a particularly clear photograph of him shaking hands with a woman outside the courthouse. "This is Rebecca Chen, isn't it? The one who helps you forge legal documents. She's been on the federal watch list for months, but they never had enough evidence to move against her. Until now." Paul stared at the photograph like it was a death sentence, which in many ways it was. The evidence against him wasn't just overwhelming. It was airtight, methodical, and complete. "You followed me," he said dully. "I investigated you. There's a difference." I put the photograph back in the folder. Following someone is what amateurs do. Investigation is what professionals do. And despite what you may have thought, I was very good at my job. The sounds from upstairs were getting more urgent. Heavy footsteps moving through my house, voices calling out instructions to each other. It wouldn't be long before they found the basement entrance. "FBI, Douglas Walker, if you're in the house, please respond." I moved toward the stairs, but Paul grabbed my arm. "Don't," he pleaded. "Please, Dad, give me 5 minutes to figure something out. There has to be another way." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then up at his face. For just a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be, the child who would run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, trusting that his father could fix anything. But that child was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen to make his living by destroying other people's lives. "There is no other way, Paul. There hasn't been for months." I gently pulled free from his grip. "The moment you decided to target elderly people, the moment you crossed that line, you sealed your fate. Everything that's happening now is just the consequence of choices you made." I started up the stairs, Paul following behind me like a condemned man walking to his execution. When I reached the basement door, I could hear the agents in my living room, their radios crackling with updates from other raid locations. "This is Douglas Walker," I called out as I opened the door. "I'm coming up from the basement." 3 FBI agents turned toward me as I emerged, their weapons lowered but ready. They were professionals, I could tell immediately, alert, controlled, focused. Behind them, I could see more agents searching my house with efficient thoroughness. "Mr. Walker," one of them said, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "I'm Agent Sarah Martinez. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," I assured her. "But you'll want to speak with my son, who should be coming up behind me." Paul emerged from the basement slowly, his hands raised, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. The agents immediately moved to secure him, professional and efficient in their movements. "Paul Walker," Agent Martinez said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, Paul looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was anger there, yes, but also something that might have been respect. For the first time in years, he was seeing his father as someone other than a weak old man to be manipulated. "Agent Martinez," I said as they finished cuffing Paul, "you'll find everything you need in the basement. The recording equipment, the documented evidence, the financial records. It's all organized and labeled." She nodded approvingly. "We received your evidence package this morning. Very thorough work, Mr. Walker. very professional. I had good teachers, I replied, thinking of all the federal agents I'd worked with over the years in my job with the prosecutor's office. As they led Paul toward the door, he stopped and turned back to me one final time. You know, he said quietly, if you'd just given me the money when I first asked, none of this would have happened. I looked at my son, this stranger who shared my DNA but none of my values, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not sadness, but pity. Because even now, even faced with the complete destruction of his life, he couldn't understand that the problem wasn't my refusal to give him money. The problem was that he'd become the kind of person who would steal from helpless elderly people and then blame his victims for his crimes. You're wrong, Paul, I said as the agents guided him toward the door. This would have happened eventually because what you became was inevitable. The only question was how many more people you'd hurt before someone stopped you. He opened his mouth to respond, but Agent Martinez was already leading him outside. Through my front window, I could see the neighborhood had come alive with activity. Federal vehicles lined the street, neighbors stood on their porches watching the drama unfold, and somewhere in the distance I could hear news helicopters circling. But inside my house, for the first time in months, there was finally silence. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in 36 hours. The house felt different somehow, not just quieter, but cleaner, as if a poison had been drawn out of it. Through my bedroom window, I could see Mrs. Henderson working in her garden, the morning sun catching the silver in her hair. She was safe now. They all were. Agent Martinez had stayed late the previous evening, going through all my documentation with a team of specialists. They'd been impressed, she told me, with the thoroughness of my investigation and the quality of the evidence I'd gathered. The case against Paul and his associates was, in her words, bulletproof. But it was the scope of their operation that had truly shocked even me. Over the course of 2 years, they'd stolen more than $2 million from elderly victims across 3 counties. Paul's confession in the basement had led to the recovery of assets I hadn't even known about, hidden accounts and properties that would help compensate some of the families they'd destroyed. My phone had been ringing constantly since news of the arrests broke. Neighbors wanting to thank me, reporters wanting interviews, old colleagues from the prosecutor's office expressing their admiration for the work I'd done. But the call that mattered most came at 8:30 that morning. Mr. Walker? The voice was elderly, female, and trembling with emotion. This is Dorothy Patterson. I'm calling about my sister, Eleanor. Mrs. Patterson's sister. The woman Paul had mentioned so casually, whose death he'd described as an unfortunate fall down the stairs. I saw the news, Dorothy continued, about your son and the others being arrested. The FBI agent who called me this morning said you were the one who gathered the evidence that exposed what they did to Eleanor. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, still holding my coffee cup. Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it took so long to bring them to justice. Don't you apologize, she said firmly, her voice growing stronger. You did what no one else could do. You stopped them from hurting anyone else. Eleanor would have been proud to know that her death led to justice for so many other families. We talked for nearly an hour. Dorothy told me about her sister's final months, how Paul and his associates had gradually isolated Eleanor from her family, convinced her that they were the only ones who truly cared about her welfare, how they'd taken control of her medications, her finances, her entire life, and how, when Eleanor had finally started asking questions about missing money, she'd suffered that convenient fall down the stairs. The medical examiner is reopening the case, Dorothy informed me. The FBI thinks they have enough evidence now to prove it wasn't an accident. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about justice and family and the choices we make that define who we really are. Paul had chosen greed over compassion, exploitation over empathy, and now he would spend the next 15 to 20 years in federal prison, assuming he survived that long. His former associates weren't known for their loyalty to people who cooperated with law enforcement. The afternoon brought more visitors. Agent Martinez returned with additional paperwork and updates on the investigation. The scope kept expanding as they followed financial trails and uncovered new victims. By her count, they'd identified 47 elderly people who had been targeted by the network, with losses ranging from a few $1,000s to complete life savings. Some of these people will never recover financially, she told me as we sat in my living room, but knowing their attackers are in prison will provide some closure, and the asset recovery process should help many of them get at least partial restitution. She paused, studying my face. How are you holding up, Mr. Walker? This can't be easy, having your own son arrested. I considered the question carefully. How was I holding up? I'd lost my son, but I'd gained something too. The knowledge that I'd done everything possible to stop him from hurting more people. That I'd honored Margaret's memory by choosing justice over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. I buried my real son 3 years ago, I said finally. The man you arrested yesterday was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize, so while this is painful, it's not tragic. Tragic would have been letting him continue destroying people's lives because I was too weak to stop him. Agent Martinez nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, I've worked financial crimes for 15 years, and I've never seen a civilian investigation as thorough as yours. You could have had a career with the Bureau. I had a career with the county prosecutor's office, 37 years of it. This was just unfinished business. After she left, I walked through my house, seeing it with new eyes. The basement where I'd been imprisoned was just a basement again, full of holiday decorations and old furniture. The study where Paul had gone through my papers was once again my private sanctuary. The living room where we'd had our final confrontation was simply a comfortable space where I could read and remember Margaret. That evening, as the sun was setting, I found myself standing in front of Margaret's photograph on the mantel. It was my favorite picture of her, taken during our vacation to the mountains just a year before she got sick. She was laughing at something I'd said, her eyes bright with joy and love. I think you would have approved, I told her photograph. I know you always believed Paul could change, could become a better person. But I also know you wouldn't have wanted him to keep hurting innocent people while we waited for that transformation. I touched the frame gently, remembering the woman who had been my moral compass for 40 years of marriage. Margaret had taught me that love sometimes means making hard choices, that protecting others is more important than protecting your own comfort. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my brother Mike calling from Arizona. Doug, I just saw the news. Are you okay? Do you need me to come out there? I smiled, touched by his concern. I'm fine, Mike. Better than fine, actually. I can't believe Paul did those things. I mean, I knew he'd been struggling since Margaret died, but this. Paul made his choices, I said simply. All I did was make sure he faced the consequences. We talked for another 20 minutes, Mike expressing his admiration for what I'd done and his regret that he hadn't been more involved in our lives since Margaret's death. It was a good conversation, the kind that reminded me that not all family relationships were toxic. After hanging up, I made myself a simple dinner and settled in my favorite chair with a book. For the first time in months, I felt truly peaceful. The house was quiet, but it was a good quiet now, not the oppressive silence of fear and uncertainty. Around 9 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Dorothy Patterson standing on my porch, holding a covered dish. I hope I'm not disturbing you, she said when I opened the door. I just wanted to bring you some of Eleanor's famous apple pie. I found her recipe in her kitchen when I was cleaning out her house. We sat at my kitchen table, sharing pie and stories about Eleanor and Margaret and the way life used to be in our neighborhood when everyone looked out for each other. Dorothy was 83 years old, sharp as a tack, and full of the kind of wisdom that only comes from living through real hardship and loss. You know, she said as she was preparing to leave, Eleanor always said that good people sometimes have to do hard things to protect those who can't protect themselves. I think she would have been proud of you. After she left, I cleaned up the kitchen and prepared for bed. As I was turning off the lights, I paused at Margaret's photograph one more time. Justice served, I said quietly. And maybe now some of these families can start to heal. I slept better that night than I had in months, knowing that my neighborhood was safe, that Paul could never hurt anyone else, and that sometimes an old man's careful planning and patient investigation could make all the difference in the world. In the distance, I could hear the sound of sirens, but they were heading away from our quiet street, toward whatever new emergency demanded attention. Here, finally, there was peace. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.